Hey, my name's Steve Walter. Today I want to talk to you about using frequency separation. It's time for a Tuesday Tips. Okay, in a previous video, I talked about how to set it up, and I think I titled it something along the lines of how to properly use and set up frequency separation. And I thought it was important to talk about that because I didn't see videos of people actually talking about it and explaining what frequency separation really was, or some people would over-explain it to a level of just like too scientific. So that's not what I want to do. I want to kind of break things down. And in that previous video, watch it, description in the link if you want to check it out, to get a better idea of thinking about frequency separation. Frequency separation, the way I think about it is you look at an image and you break it down into color and you break it down into texture. That's it. Color, low frequency, texture, high frequency. Once you start thinking about your images that way, you can use frequency separation as a tool to retouch just about anything. In this video specifically, I want to show you how I use it to retouch a product, right? It works exactly the same if you're doing someone's face, a carpet on the floor, a wall, a can, an avocado. It all works the same. You just need to think about things as texture and as color. So in this video, I want to show you how I use it to retouch a can of beer. Now, I'm not going to do a full retouch of the can. I just want to show you how I would approach the problem areas, okay? So let's dive into it. So here I am in Capture One. This is my preferred editor of choice. Here is the before and here's the after. So you can see that I've already retouched it. I got this can of beer on the left. This is straight out of the camera. So I want to retouch this. I've already opened it up in Photoshop as a 16-bit image. If you're not familiar in Capture One, you can do a right click, edit with, Photoshop, and then there it will ask you, do you want 16 or 8-bit? 16-bit because it's just going to give me more color. 8-bit is going to be fine for most uses. I know in my previous video, I swore so hard on 16-bit, and I still stand by that if you want 100% color accuracy, and in this case I do, but 8-bit for majority of images, just fine. Especially when you consider the fact that people are viewing this at 1080 by 1080 on a phone, not an issue. Let's head over to Photoshop. Here we go. Let's set up this image with the frequency separation method that I prefer to use. So I'll explain. So Command J twice. Let's name this low. Let's name this high, or color, texture, whatever you prefer. I'm gonna hide that low layer, or sorry, hide the high layer. I'm gonna go to filter. You'd think I go to blur, but I don't. The method that I like using is median, which is underneath noise. So median, what this does, let's take a look. It sort of blurs your image, but what it does is it preserves edge detail. So let's zoom in here to 100%, Command 1, and you can see that it's starting to kind of smudge things around. But what I want to do is remove the texture. So let's find an area where I know there's going to be a problem. Okay, so right over here at the top. I'm going to turn off preview just for a second. So you can see that there's a bunch of scratches on this can, right? Over here in these real specular highlights, you can see all of these scratches are really starting to show up. So right now I have a radius of 7, and if I turn preview on to show me what this median blur is going to do, you can see what it does is it removes all of that texture, and it still leaves me with some really nice clean edges, but all that texture is gone, right? So 7 looks like it's gonna work pretty well. Let's go up to 8. Does that get rid of any more that I really need? I think 8's gonna be just fine. So again, what I'm doing right now is I'm analyzing my image based on the resolution, based on the detail that I see. How much blur do I need to remove the texture, right? Because that's the process, is I wanna look at this can and say, okay, all of this dust and all of these unwanted details, I wanna easily get rid of them by retouching them on the texture layer. So that's what I'm looking for. So I'm gonna hit preview, I'm gonna say, okay. Now the trick with using median is you want to apply it twice because it's not a blur, it's not a traditional blur. It blurs, but it doesn't do a very good blur. So running it a second time is suggested because what that does is that just kind of helps to smooth things out a little bit more to make your color layer a little bit more effective. Make sure you use the exact same radius. Cool. All right, good. Now let's go on to our high layer. So here's our texture layer, and now is when we want to extract the color from this layer, leaving us with the texture layer. So let's do that now. So we'll go to image, apply image. I want to target my, well, in this case, yes, my low layer. I want to target the low layer. I want to make sure invert is checked. I want to make sure my blending is set to add. I want to make sure my scale is at 2 and my offset is at 0. So what I just said was that we're going to use this process to subtract the color, but we're using a blending of add, but we're inverting it. So the inverse of add is subtract. We'll say okay to this. And then what we're going to do is set this to linear light. Good. Now we can group these two if we want to. And here is our frequency separated group. Okay, now let's start retouching. So I'm gonna go into this group and I'm gonna start with the texture because I know that's the area that I really wanna start messing with. I should mention that I'm using a Wacom Stylus. I just prefer to use this because it allows me to naturally go through and clean things up, smudge things, retouch, all of that stuff. So I highly recommend it. You can definitely do this with a trackpad or a mouse. I just prefer to use a stylus. So let's go to our texture layer. And now what I want to do is I want to grab the clone stamp tool, S on the keyboard. Right now I have my opacity and flow set to 100%. That's what I want because I want to grab texture from an area that in my opinion is good and replace it on an area that I think is bad. And then I also want to make sure that I'm only set to my current layer. I don't want to sample from anything below. The whole benefit of frequency separation is the ability to isolate these two layers, texture and color. So I want to make sure that I'm targeted just on this current layer, okay? And if it's helpful for you to really see it, let's turn off our background, but let's also turn off our color layer. So now I can start to see the texture. And immediately this stuff starts to jump out at me as areas that I want to clean up. So with the clone stamp selected, I can adjust the size of my brush using my bracket keys. I'm going to sample and then paint over areas that I don't want. You want to make sure that you're sampling from an area that is similar to the texture that you're painting over, meaning this area up here at the top that is very, rough and grainy, I wouldn't want to sample from there and then paint over down here where it's not rough and grainy because they don't match, right? Easy enough to think about. So I want to sample from over here where it's a little smoother and then paint over this. Good. So let's just continue with this process. Now again, I'm not going to do a full can retouch. That's over an hour plus of me trying to explain and then show you the process. So I'm just going to kind of clean up some of these obvious areas. If it is helpful for you to see the color layer as we're retouching, let's turn that back on. And now on the texture layer, what's cool is when you're cleaning this up, you see it just vanishes. Stuff just disappears. Because when I did that initial blur, I isolated all of these little textures to be on their own layer. So once I clean them up, they're gone for good. Now in some cases, your texture might be a little too big and it ends up on both layers, meaning you have to clean up a little bit on your texture, you have to clean up a little bit on your color. So you kind of go back and forth a little bit, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty fast, right? So now I can just very quickly go through and dot. That one just worked fine. Let's clean this, let's clean this. So you don't always have to sample and paint, but sometimes you do. Over here, let's clean this up. And then even if I start getting into this, I can clean up these little bits. Now this starts to become a bit more of a problem area. If this is your first time approaching this, we're not going to dive too deep into that. But let's just start cleaning all this stuff up over here. Not all of it, some of it. So you get the idea, right? I'm sampling from some texture that is good, painting over texture that is bad, and everything looks lovely. You want to make sure that you are sampling from similar areas to cover that up. So for example, this area that I just did, undo that. Right here, there is texture, but there's also color that needs some work. So I'm going to sample for the texture that's good, paint over that, and you can see that it's still a little bit washed out there. So I need to go reapproach that with some color. So sample, cool. So I've cleaned up a little bit of texture over there. Now what I want to do is fix some of these color areas, right? So now let's target this layer below, the low layer. And again, if I turn off the texture layer, you can see this is what my color layer looks like. So here is that area. Let's start there. Here's that area that still needs a little bit of work. The way that you want to think about this is you want to take the color that's surrounding it, just like I took the texture that's surrounding it, and replace it. And one of the easiest ways to do that is with the mixer brush tool. So let's use that. If you go over to your brushes, click and hold all the way down here at the bottom, mixer brush. There's a couple things that you're going to want to have set up for this to work correctly, or at least for this method. I'm sure you could Google or YouTube a whole tutorial on the mixer brush and how amazing it is. I want to show you how I use it here for retouching with frequency separation. So first and foremost, make sure this box is checked. And this says to clean the brush every time you do a stroke, right? So if I paint and I pick up my brush, it's clean, and I paint again, I don't have that old color. I'm using my finger because it's kind of like finger painting. If I were to dip my finger in red and smudge it, and then dip my finger in red and then smudge it over something that's blue, what am I gonna get? Purple. I don't want purple. So I wanna make sure that each time I smudge, I'm getting a clean brush. Good. Next, over here, I like to start with wet 30 and flow 30. Load and mix, I leave it 100%. Why? Because that's how I learned it. But the flow and wet are numbers that you can adjust depending upon how much paint, that's how I think about it, right? How much paint you want to smudge around. So you can adjust those by using the number pad on your keyboard. So if I hit 5, that's going to adjust my wet to 50%. If I do shift 5, that's going to adjust my flow to 50%. So 30, 30 is usually where I like to start, and then I increase and adjust as I need to. Cool. Also, make sure sample all layers is unchecked. Everything else, you can just leave that alone, leave it as is, okay? So the brush size is important. If I make this brush size really big, I'm smudging all of this paint and moving it over. I'm gonna undo that. So I wanna make my brush size about the size of my object, for the most part. Sometimes it's a little smaller, a little bit bigger, but about the size of the object that I'm trying to cover up. In this case, I'll make it a little bit smaller. And what I'm gonna do is start over here, click and just drag it over, click and drag over, click and drag over, and continue to do that. And then I'll go back the other direction, and it's gone. That's it. You just want to smudge back and forth. Let me just demonstrate that in an area that doesn't matter. So I'm going to make this really big, and I'm going to drag up, drag up, drag up, drag up, drag up. You can see what I'm doing is I'm starting to smudge that paint, but then there are those lines there. So then you drag down, you drag down, you drag down. You start to smooth everything out. So that's the idea. I'm going to undo that a bunch so that goes away. Cool. So now what I need to do is look at areas on this can and determine, like this area right over here that has like a little hot spot. I just start painting that away. And even this highlight that's kind of happening here on the neck or the shoulder of the can, I want that to be a little bit smoother overall. So I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. Maybe I'll reduce my flow to 10%. And just start painting that. And that's how I think about this, is painting. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm following the contour of the can. Because if I start to drag down, for example, I'm starting to introduce this highlight into a darker area, and that's not what I want. When I'm blending, you want to think about painting. So this highlight here, if I want to get rid of this super hot highlight, I need to start grabbing in pigment that isn't as hot or overexposed, so I can start just brushing this in over here. And depending upon how much finesse or how much time I want to put into this, I might, if I go to 100% and 100% flow and wetness and I start doing that, you can see I'm just grabbing all of it and moving it over. But that's not, it doesn't look natural. So I'm going to undo, undo, undo. Let's turn our texture layer back on so we can see our work as we're doing it. So here you can see that there's a problem area, right? This needs a bunch of work, right? I would need to go through and clean up the texture and clean up the color. Again, I want to just sort of introduce you to this approach. If I come back down, maybe let's look for some more areas. Let's use this area right over here, this text that's happening here. This is a pretty easy cleanup, okay? So let's first go to our texture layer. And I'm gonna hold Option and click on that eyeball so it just shows me the layer that I've clicked on. So here's our texture. So if I go to the S clone stamp tool, right? S for the clone stamp. And if I sample up here and start painting down here, you can see I'm getting rid of all of this text. And I'm sampling from an area on the edge of this can that would match. So I can sample from up here and paint down, paint down. I'm just gonna paint down all of that text. Good. So that text is gone, and my neuroses won't let me leave these alone, so I'm gonna clean those up too. Now, the texture where you grab it from, sometimes you might see a repeating pattern. For the most part, you won't. You just won't. Now let's come over here to our low layer. I'm gonna go to my mixer brush tool, and now what I need to do is grab the color from above here and just smudge it down. Now I'm still at 100% on both sides. Let's maybe bring it to 80 for each. And what I'm gonna do is start to drag down. Now, in order for me to make sure that this line, and you can see that did a pretty good job to start, but in order for me to make sure that this line is maintained, what I can do is position my brush at about a third over there, right? I'm gonna click once. Now I'm gonna hold shift and come down here and try to do the same, position it about a third over and click. And it draws that straight line for me. So if I click up here and then hold shift and then click down here, I'm just clicking once. I'm not even painting right now because I wanna maintain that straight vertical. I'm gonna click, hold shift and click. And then now I'll finish up here by just dragging it down. And now I've cleaned all of that text up. So here is before and after right there, before and after. Pretty quickly I've cleaned that up. Now I might want to go back in here on the texture. It's up to you to decide how polished you want your retouch to be. Do you want this can to look like it was rendered in a 3D program? Or do you want it to look like it was photographed and maybe it has some imperfections, you just want to make it more perfect than the imperfections allow. So clean that up, and there we can see that I've gone through and done a pretty decent job of cleaning that up. Now, you can imagine that as you look at this can, as I pan around here, there's all kinds of little problem areas, but once you start breaking this down, thinking about it as color and as texture, and just clean it up based off of that, it's not that difficult. I hope that gives you a better idea of how I would go through retouching, in this case, a product. I'm gonna make another video where I talk about retouching portraits. That's gonna come later, but I just wanted to show you how I use frequency separation in retouching, in this case, a product, a can. And I hope this was a nice follow-up to the video that I made previously where I got a lot of really positive feedback on setting up frequency separation. In that previous video, I used the Gaussian blur method. I did that because that's what most people use, or at least most people use when approaching frequency separation. I have since found that the median blur, or the noise median, is a much better method for my use case, because what it does is it preserves edge detail in a lot of product work and even in faces. So when I do the face retouch, you'll see that applied there as well. So until next time, see ya.